I don't know how much you're familiar with the military occupation of North Carolina, but I guess the first thing I should start with is that for those who are uninformed, that eastern North Carolina was occupied by the Union Army very early in the war, in March of 1862. The locations that I focus on today are Beaufort and New Bern, which is Carteret and Craven County, North Carolina, because the Union Army arrived there in March of '62 and stayed for the remainder of the war, so there wasn't any back and forth. So it gives you an opportunity to have a very focused look at how occupation played out during one region continuously. So with that preamble, again here. Wednesday, January 14th, 1863, found Beaufort, North Carolina still dry, with recent tempest and getting colder by the hour. The weather had not been the only turbulent event that week. Captain William B. Fowle, Jr., Beaufort's provost marshal, sat down that morning to write a letter to a superior officer relating an event that occurred earlier that week, when an African-American woman had encountered two prominent Unionists in the town, Joel Henry Davis and Henry Rieger. Fowle writes, Mr. Davis and Mr. Rieger together tied the woman to a tree, her arms over her head, and then whipped her severely. The flesh on her arms where the rope went was badly lacerated. Her arms were covered with blood when I saw her. She was only released upon the peremptory order of a private of the 9th New Jersey, who says the treatment was very cruel. Her crime was that she demanded her daughter, whom Mr. Davis retained in slavery. She was a smart, intelligent woman and quite able to support herself and her children. End quote. This story illustrates one of the ways in which African Americans asserted their independence and the violent reactions that such assertions could cause in the wake of the Emancipation Proclamation in occupied Carteret and Craven counties. Many slaves felt emboldened by the proclamation as a direct acknowledgement of their right to freedom and as a consequence of their right to assert themselves. Perhaps it was under such influences on this brisk early January day that this African American woman sought out Davis, a man whom she knew well, to insist that her daughter be released from servitude, provoking the incident described, because after all, the Emancipation Proclamation had taken effect 2 weeks earlier, and Davis was sort of ignoring that. The woman's ability to support herself and her assertion of her independence rankled the former slaveholder Davis as much as any federal policy, as it challenged his traditional social authority. For financial reasons, Davis had embraced Union occupation, but he would not tolerate black expectations to equal rights. Davis's violent attack was his own personal, physical attempt to stem the tide of racial equality that he felt the federal government seemed to be ushering into the region. This example suggests the tensions inherent in the creation of a new order that began when Union soldiers arrived in southern communities. Despite white resistance, blacks were savvy pragmatists who utilized the Union Army and the agents of northern benevolent societies, such as the Freedmen's Aid Association, the American Missionary Association that came south. And they utilized these societies to attain what I call the 4 pillars of their empowerment. And they all start with E, so that's a nice alliterative device. Escape, employment, enlistment, and perhaps most importantly, education. Freedmen were remarkably successful at achieving their empowerment goals during the wartime occupation, and hoped that success would lead to greater opportunities for independence and autonomy once the war ended. In this, of course, if you're familiar with the history of Reconstruction in the South, they were often frustrated. Once the war ended, the federal government withdrew its wartime level of support, reneged on many promises, and allowed former Confederates to regain control of their abandoned lands. Yet this should not diminish the story of the black struggle for autonomy under Union occupation. Blacks gained much success in those years during the war when they were able to assert their independence, confident in the support of the federal government. Now, the Yankees came to this region, this coastal North Carolina region, on March 13, 1862, when a large expeditionary force under General Ambrose E. Burnside, the infamous lamb chop sideburns, landed south of New Bern. After a brief battle, Burnside's force captured New Bern on March 14 and Beaufort on March 25th, beginning an occupation that would last the rest of the war. Hoping to escape the war's uncertainty and to take advantage of new economic opportunities, many local whites forsook the Confederacy and pledged their allegiance to the Union, some more equivocally than others. But this was a general trend. A lot of whites in the region decided, well, now that the Union Army's here, pretty good economic deal for us. They pay in cash, and the inflation rate is much lower than Confederate money, so I'm a Unionist again. However, the most unequivocal demonstration of loyalty came from African Americans, who sought control over their own bodies, minds, and material conditions, and asserted their independence, especially among their former masters. Embittered local whites placed all the blame for such radical black actions on the Union soldiers and the federal government. Local slaveholders declared that their slaves were content within the confines of the peculiar institution and did not desire independence. Please. We haven't been going terribly long, so we haven't missed much. James Rumley, a secessionist diarist who remained in Beaufort during occupation, was convinced that the slaves would actually have little of this feeling for independence if left alone. Rumley conveniently ignored reality, however, for as he and other slave owners knew well, African Americans had actually been trying to ameliorate the hardships and establish some sort of self-control over their lives for decades before Union soldiers arrived. Whether it was doggedly maintaining a family, as indicated by Heather Williams' talk today, whether it was carving out a cultural space for them outside of the fields, whether it was engaging in an illegal internal economy, engaging in trade with local whites, sort of under the cover of darkness, or whether it was simply by running away, which was very common. All you have to do is look at any antebellum advertisements in the region to realize that there was an awful lot of runaways from this region. Soon after Union soldiers arrived, slaves turned their attention to taking more tangible items than just their own personal liberty. In New Bern, General Burnside informed Secretary of War Edwin Stanton that 9/10 of the depredations on March 14th, after the enemy and the citizens had fled from the town, were committed by the Negroes before our troops entered the city. The efficiency of looting by local blacks impressed Union soldiers who displayed remarkable skill themselves when it came to plundering. One Union soldier noted, "The Negroes take advantage and become masters of their masters' houses and things, and they went in for spoils and things had to fly." That's the quote. The arrival of Union forces offered more than just prospects for plunder. It afforded slaves opportunities to attain the four pillars of their empowerment. The first and foremost pillar was escape, without which none of the others could follow. Numerous slaves in the countryside fled their masters and sought freedom under the protection of the Union Army. Union soldiers documented the flood of black refugees. Burnside's personal secretary, Daniel Reed Larned, wrote, "Stealing in from every direction by land and sea, in squads from 6 to 30, they come and plant themselves by the side of the fence and wait for orders from Mr. Burnside." "They are continually coming in," another soldier wrote, "in squads of from 1 to a dozen, threading their way through the swamps at night, avoiding pickets that they at last reach our line." Slaves also testified to their immense desire for freedom. George Harris, a Jones County slave, recalled that his master had concealed George and his fellow slaves in the woods, minding horses and taking care of things that he had hid there. George and the other slaves decided to leave together in a gang and, quote, ran away to New Bern, about 25 miles away. This irresistible impulse for freedom compelled many slaves to perform amazing feats to rescue friends and family members. The boldness of the slave who had just escaped from New Bern in April of 1862 astounded one Massachusetts soldier. The slave had just heard that his wife was about 7 miles, this is a quote, was about 7 miles above our pickets, and that the rebels were going to carry her off up country, he wrote. He wanted to go and get her, and of course we gave consent, and I have no doubt that he will evade their pickets and bring her in safely. Testifying before the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission at Fort Monroe, Virginia on May 9, 1863, a Union provost was asked, quote, "In your opinion, is there any communication between the refugees and the black men still in slavery?" He replied, "Yes, sir. We have men here who have gone back 200 miles to retrieve slaves." End quote. So many slave refugees dramatically boosted the coastal towns' populations. So to put this in perspective, Beaufort, total white and black population before the war broke out was about 1,600, including 600 of whom were black. But it becomes home to nearly 2,500 refugee slaves by January of 1864 and over 3,200 by 1865. While New Bern housed over 8,500 freedmen in January of 64 and nearly 11,000 a year later. New Bern's slave and free black population in 1860 was less than 3,000. So in New Bern, the number quadruples, basically. Slaves discovered that they had useful allies in the Northern soldiers who would often directly intervene to ensure a slave's successful escape. Slaves came to Union lines as contraband. North Carolina's military governor, Edward Stanley, who had been appointed by President Lincoln in charge of enforcing North Carolina's antebellum laws. Stanley was a Unionist. He had been living in California for a while, but he was from the region. Lincoln brought him back and made him military governor. Well, Stanley deemed them fugitive slaves and subjected to be returned to their owners. In the first test of Stanley's authority, a local farmer named Nicholas Bray visited Stanley's headquarters in New Bern and claimed that a Northern soldier had taken his female slave. After Bray took the oath of allegiance, Stanley granted him permission to retrieve his slave. Northern soldiers reacted angrily when they heard this. A Union soldier readily acknowledged, quote, "A A party of our men had made the braves a visit, held a pistol to the head of Brave's wife, and put the girl in a carriage and left. And we burned one of his houses and his fence. And so, end quote. Stanley's impotence in the matter only emboldened soldiers further. One stated, quote, "So this kidnapping game has been played out in a brief and summary manner. It will soon be attempted again. The feeling is deep and bitter amongst the soldiers and many of the officers," end quote. To native whites, of course, such actions by Northern soldiers only portended much more ominous initiatives in regard to African Americans. Because this was in May of 1862. Lincoln's not even going to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation until September. So for local whites, they're really recognizing that the Massachusetts soldiers who were stationed in the region are already helping slaves to escape from their masters. And so for local whites, they're starting to become concerned that this isn't what we signed up for. But it's just another example of how slaves utilized the Union soldiers to gain their freedom. Indeed, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation reaffirmed white fears, particularly because North Carolina was not exempted from the proclamation, unlike most other areas under Union occupation. African Americans were also aware of the proclamation's meaning. One Union soldier in New Bern commented, "Although they could neither read nor write, slaves were quite well informed upon the President's proclamation, at least the portion relating to their own immediate change of condition, meaning freedom." Another soldier concurred, "The Negroes are on the whole, so far as I've seen, more intelligent and clear-headed than I fancied, and are considerably interested in the President's proclamation, which many of them understand very well." Sort of ties in with the earlier talk this morning about the sort of political reality that slaves knew. A new day had dawned for slaves, and their hopefulness and joy at future prospects became infectious. One missionary noted that blacks, quote, "beheld visions of freedom and civilization opening before them, which he admitted inspired my heart with enthusiasm." Often blacks' desire to assert their independence led to confrontations with local whites over the nature of what it meant to be free and to occupy a place in this new civilization. Many confrontations were rather benign. James Rumley complained of the Negroes look on with indifference, as delicate women and aged men have to perform drudgeries to which they have never been accustomed. You can imagine the slave weren't all that terribly concerned about that. The slaves also engaged in verbal rows with whites. One white New Bern resident complained, "It is nothing unusual for the Negroes to curse their masters and mistresses in passing along the streets. They are allowed to do so by the Yankees," end quote. Throughout the time of occupation, however, some black assertions of independence led to more malevolent confrontations, as whites used violence to try to intimidate blacks. A military court found that New Bern civilian Edward Hughes, quote, "did commit an assault with intent to kill upon a black woman in New Bern by shooting at her twice with a pistol, both shots taking effect upon her person." Union soldiers noted that rebel pickets would shoot at blacks whenever an opportunity afforded itself. In March of 1865, a freed slave, quote, "was accosted by a man with a double-barreled gun, who after asking him some questions, deliberately killed him," end quote. The most illustrative example, of course, of violent confrontation in the wake of emancipation was the story that opened this chapter, when Joel Henry Davis tied up and mercilessly beat his former slave for demanding that he release her daughter from bondage. In addition to escaping from and confronting their former masters, blacks sought employment. This would be the second pillar of empowerment, if you will, especially such that would give them a chance for land ownership, a foundational piece of autonomy. Many tried to set up their own farms. The desire to be independent and autonomous drove some African Americans to risky lengths. Horace James, who was superintendent of the Negroes in the region, Horace James declared that with no land available on which to settle freedmen, some of the more fearless among them did indeed venture to hire tracts of land a little out of the towns and on the debatable territory along the railroad and the Neuse River, in an attempt to attempt the culture of cotton or corn or the making of turpentine, end quote, sorry, long quote. James admitted that those who desperately sought such independence took their chances with Confederate raiders and often forfeited their freedom or even their lives, as many of them were attacked in bushwhacking attacks and were killed. Escaped slaves also began working for the Union Army from the moment it first arrived. In April of 1862, just a month after the capture of New Bern, one Union soldier noted that over 700 able-bodied black men had arrived in town looking for work. They find employment, he wrote. Some work in the fortifications, some unloading ships. More are really needed to perform the labor to be done here. The government employed many freedmen in quartermaster department as teamsters and manual laborers. Some blacks served more specialized roles. Willis Lewis, a free black in New Bern, served at different times as a guide and a scout for federal troops, as well as a nurse at regimental hospitals. Jacob Grimes, an escaped slave, came to New Bern and, quote, was employed by the U.S. government as a detective, end quote, presumably to monitor illicit trading or treasonous activities against the federal government. Black women also utilized their domestic skills to earn income. They provided meals, mended uniforms, washed clothes for the Union soldiers. Others baked goods and sold them to the Army for quite a profit. One soldier noted, "Some are very intelligent and charge reasonable prices for things, while the whites ask 4 times what they are worth." Some women established legendary reputations as cooks. One soldier wrote a friend of how he and some friends had gone down to Jane's place, where they enjoyed a savory meal of pork steak, fried liver, baked sweet potatoes, hoe cake, and coffee. Quote, "She was cook for one of the first families," he wrote, "and now drives quite a business on her own account." Unable to make any money as a slave, Jane had parlayed her skills into a lucrative business after she gained her freedom. And even Horace James, who wrote an account of the occupation through this region, even Horace James was amazed at how prosperous her restaurant business, if you will, turned out to be. Slave craftsmen also took maximum advantage of their skills. Coopers, wheelwrights, and carpenters worked for the Union Army. In 1865, James wrote, "Slaves have come in, and among them are many mechanics and skilled laborers, so that Newbern now has a good supply of tradesmen in nearly all the different branches essential to social prosperity." Slave mariners converted their skills in service for the Union authorities. Caesar Manson worked as a boatman carrying the U.S. mail, while others shuttled goods and passengers between Fort Macon, Beaufort, and Morehead City. Horace James noted the preponderance of black men and black water men in the region. Quote, "Not less than 100 men are constantly employed in boating, this business being wholly in the hands of the Negroes, and a profitable calling it proves to be indeed," end quote. In addition to providing valuable services to the Union personnel and securing their own financial freedom, employment allowed for the building of a robust, free black community. One of the strongest centers of social engagement was the local barbershop. In Beaufort, David Parker, a literate freedman, opened a barbershop that served as a nexus of freedmen's activity. Quote, "Many times in my shop we talked about the war," he recalled. "Sometimes I received papers and I could read them. I could tell the people what battles had been fought. My shop was a sort of general headquarters for the colored people to come to for news," end quote. Not only was it an important social center, but it also exemplified one of the most lucrative types of employment in the occupied region. When James listed the highest grossing occupations among freedmen in 1864, barbers were near the top of the list, earning an average annual income of $675, compared to an enlisted man whose yearly income was only $156, $13 a month for 4 months. I know at least that much math. James further observed that many of the freedmen, not just barbers, were prospering under occupation. Quote, "Some of these people are becoming rich. All are doing well for themselves, even in these times. Grocers, carpenters, blacksmiths, coopers, masons, and turpentine farmers all made handsome average incomes above $400 a year. Some individual freedmen, primarily those engaged in the turpentine business, earned more than $3,000 in 1 year, while over a dozen from other assorted occupations grossed more than $1,000 in 1864. James was greatly impressed, and this is a Massachusetts minister who had come south as a chaplain for the 25th Massachusetts Regiment and then became superintendent. James writes, "They evince a capacity for business and exhibit a degree of thrift and shrewdness which are ample security for their future progress, if they were allowed an equal chance with their fellow men," end quote. Many black men felt that enlisting in the United States Armed Forces allowed them the greatest opportunity for that equal chance to demonstrate their manhood. Some local freedmen served as sailors and seamen on military and commercial Union vessels, while others enlisted into colored infantry regiments. Many had been waiting for the opportunity from the moment Union troops arrived. William Henry Singleton, a Craven County slave, claimed that over 100 black refugees had been drilling on their own as early as the spring of 1862, anticipating the time when the Lincoln administration would finally allow African Americans to enlist in the Army. And it doesn't formally start occurring until the spring of '63, a year later. In January of 1863, one Massachusetts soldier writes, "I think there could be here 1,000 who were formerly slaves, who would enlist in the Union Army, who would fight like tigers to defend their rights as they now enjoy them," end quote. Indeed, when the federal government finally authorized the enlistment of black soldiers in the region a month later, volunteers flocked to the enlistment office. And actually, for those of you who were there yesterday and heard Harry Jones talk about Abraham Galloway, who and David Soselsky writes a really excellent book on Galloway, it really does the digging and tells his life. Galloway he was in Newbern. He ended up acting as a negotiator with Union officers for the rights of black soldiers. And one of the sort of negotiating tactics Galloway took was to blindfold a Union officer, carry him to an attic. When he took the blindfold off, he was sitting there facing a bunch of guys carrying weapons saying, okay, here are the demands that we have for you. And the officer's like, no mas, absolutely, whatever. So and that story is related in Soselsky's book, and you should really check it out. In the first muster of February 1863, a Union officer reported that 413 African Americans had already answered the roll. In April, a Union soldier noted, they are enlisting Negroes here at a great rate. 200 nearly enlisted in about 2 days. On May 24th, a Union officer reported that over 400 had enlisted that week alone. The pride and satisfaction that black men enjoyed from enlisting became apparent to outside observers. One Union soldier who had feared that freedmen could not be, quote, converted into serviceable recruits, was amazed to see their transformation. His quote is, the national uniform was as a magic robe to them, and they straightened up and stood erect in it, at once men and soldiers. Indeed, the act of enlisting served as a major source of empowerment for black men throughout the region, and the prospect of participating in winning their own independence prompted thousands to enlist before the war ended. Though unfortunately accurate numbers of black enlistments from Carteret and Craven County specifically are difficult to ascertain, over 5,000 blacks did join the Union Army from North Carolina, almost all of them from the occupied region of the state along the coast. The majority of the black men who joined the New Bern were formed in the 3 United States Colored Troops regiments that became known as the African Brigade, or the Corps, the African Brigade. Black enlistment efforts met resistance, of course, as they encountered hostility from local whites, but as well from Union soldiers. Many white soldiers, even liberal anti-slavery ones, maintained decidedly racist views upon their arrival. One abolitionist captain wrote that blacks, quote, as a class, are lazy, filthy, ragged, dishonest, and stupid. This is a guy who actually was opposed to slavery and wanted to end it. Burnside's aide, Daniel Larned, another abolitionist officer from Rhode Island, shared that officer's sentiment, remarking, quote, they are the laziest and most degraded set of beings I ever saw. So, despite the fact that they oppose the institution of slavery, they still can't reconcile sort of their abstract racial attitudes and their own prejudices against the slaves themselves. A female observer noticed that this anger amongst the Union soldiers seemed to be hierarchical. As a rule, it seemed to go stronger as you descend in rank, privates having more feeling than the officers, end quote, though not always. Over dinner one day in 1863, Commodore Henry Davenport, commander of the Union gunboat squadron, asked a fellow officer, quote, what should you do, sir, if you were to meet a Negro colonel? Should you salute him? Certainly I should, replied the officer, adding that rank outweighed skin color. Quote, the Commodore looked at him with horror and getting up from his chair gesticulated violently, exclaiming in his indignation, my blood boils at the thought. So again, can't get past certain racial prejudices no matter how much they despise slavery. Union soldiers eventually adapted to the presence of black soldiers and accepted them as, if nothing else, a means to help end the war. When the 55th Massachusetts Colored Regiment arrived in July of 1863, a Union soldier declared, I do not object to black soldiers, but rather think that they should do some of the fighting. A naval officer admitted his misconception of black soldiers. Quote, I had never believed that a common plantation Negro could be brought to face a white man. I suppose that everything in the shape of spirit and self-respect had been crushed out of them generations back. But I am glad to find myself mistaken, end quote. In addition to freedom, employment, and enlistment, former slaves embraced the educational opportunities offered by Union soldiers and members of the Freedmen's Aid Societies in the region. Indeed, one American Missionary Association teacher in New Bern wrote in September of '63 that for local blacks, learning to read seems to be the height of their ambition. Of course, Union attempts to educate blacks angered local whites and created conflict between Union officers and military governor Edward Stanley. Stanley arrived again. In April of '62, Vincent Collier, recently appointed superintendent of the poor, had set up a day school for whites with 2 evening schools for blacks in New Bern that had over 800 students. However, when Governor Stanley arrived in May, he ordered Collier to close the school on the grounds that teaching blacks to read was against North Carolina state law. Collier obeyed, but then he goes to Washington to protest. President Lincoln assures Collier that he had not given Stanley power to close the school, and furthermore, quote, that he had given Governor Stanley no such instructions as would justify him in these acts. Collier returns to New Bern, reopens the schools over Stanley's protests. Individual officers, soldiers, and benevolent society teachers operated makeshift schools wherever there was room. Teachers held classes in churches, army barracks, barns, abandoned plantation buildings, basements, deserted jails, and one officer taught his pupils in the rear of the quartermaster's office. Instructors also improvised teaching supplies. One soldier related that as primers were not at hand, a yellow green window shutter served for a blackboard, the instruction being mainly oral. Teachers utilized Bibles as standard texts. Yet Union agents were improving the situation as quickly as possible, constructing new schools and recruiting supplies and teachers from Northern societies. By March of 1864, New Bern boasted 11 freedmen schools, and Beaufort had 3. Determined freedmen used every spare minute to study. A soldier in the 23rd Massachusetts wrote, "Grown men employed in catching and rafting logs brought on their way to the sawmill their spelling books, which they speedily whipped out and zealously studied at every break, however short in their onerous task." An officer's wife, visiting her husband at New Bern in February of '63, wrote to a friend, "I have frequently seen in the street the Negro teamsters poring over their primers and spelling books while waiting for something or other." A missionary noted, "After a hard day's work, they return to their homes, take their frugal meal, change their dress when they can change, and come to school to devote an hour and a half to earnest study." African American students and white teachers persevered in spite of hostile conditions. Weather difficulties, the exigency of wartime. New Bern was attacked in 1863 and 1864, and there was a huge yellow fever outbreak in the summer of '64 that shut things down for a while. But local whites also tried to terrorize Northern teachers and black students to prevent them from attending schools. In 1864, 3 white men torched one of the freedmen schoolhouses and threatened the female teacher with violence unless she promised to, and I quote, "never again teach the niggers to read," end quote. For whites, this instruction held dangerous implications, as Northern teachers taught ideas that transcended spiritual lessons and charitable efforts to teach literacy. At the same time, however, Northern missionaries' ideas about what was best for freedmen often conflicted with what the freedmen themselves believed. During their experience, freedmen found that many missionaries rarely viewed them as equals. Many Northerners dismissed freedmen's emotional religious tradition as ludicrous and saddening. That's a quote. Missionaries sought to remake them in an idealized Northern middle-class Christian image. African Americans were quite practical, however, accepting a certain amount of Northern proselytizing while utilizing benevolent society members to garner the material possessions as well as intellectual ones they needed to achieve autonomy. One Northern missionary who had hoped to convert what they thought were ignorant former slaves noted, quote, "It is wonderful how much more influence you can have over those who do not believe by doing something for their souls and their bodies at the same time, such as distributing blankets and handing out other equipment." The young woman did not understand that this was most likely part of the freedmen's plan. Few freedmen rejected the idea of a Christian afterlife, in which the ills of this world would be replaced by the glories of the next. However, many recognized the value of playing to Northern stereotypes of their ignorance in order to help address the insufficient material possessions. Missionaries not only redeemed freedmen's spiritual souls, but also heightened their awareness of their political bodies and the rights inherent in being a free person, offering visions of a promising future in which African Americans could control their own destinies without being beholden to whites. A black soldier's comment to the American Missionary Association teacher reveals that African Americans hardly imbibed from this hopeful fund. Do you know how responsible your situation is? We listen to every word that you utter to us, so that nothing you utter is lost to any of us. If we do just as you instruct us to do, and we lose our souls, whose fault will it be? End quote. His quote serves as an effective metaphor for those who did not dread their eternal damnation as much as potentially worldly one. If free people diligently followed the advice of their Northern deliverers, and the promises of respect, economic independence, and personal autonomy did not emerge, their betrayal would be devastating. Ultimately, such betrayals would begin as soon as the war ended. By 1877, unconcerned in the end whether blacks would be treated justly or not, the Northern people and the federal government abandoned African Americans throughout the South to disfranchisement, lynching, segregation, and the Jim Crow that followed. Black efforts at political and economic empowerment simply increased white hostility. Blacks found little support from local unionists who generally disapproved of black suffrage and preferred that blacks work as wage laborers instead of independent proprietors. However, despite post-war developments, which weren't as positive as they should have been, African Americans could recall the years of Union wartime occupation when they actively took control of their own autonomous lives. Such efforts had given them a sense of hope that they would build on in the post-war years. Indeed, visions of freedom and civilization did appear to be opening toward them. Blacks would utilize the memory of these visions as support for the future, as they would discover new forms of empowerment to maintain control of their own lives as much as possible in the face of white hostility and federal neglect in the Reconstruction and the post-war period. Thank you very much.